Hey, it's Drybear. Week 4 for Season 1 Dragonflight is coming to a close, so it's time to check in on the DPS rankings for all the specializations in the game. I pull all the numbers from all the parses that have been submitted worldwide and put them all together and stack them together so we can see which classes are outperforming others in Raid and Mythic Plus. So let's jump into it. As always, if you have any questions or comments for me, you'll find me live every day on twitch.tv/Drybear. Come by and say hi. So here we are, the latest numbers for week 4 damage classes. I have separated this into 3 categories. Heroic Raid, where usually difficulty doesn't restrict classes. They get to do basically anything. It's almost like running wild in an open field. The difficulty of Heroic Raid doesn't really restrict some classes and they get crazy parses. Mythic Raid, where the difficulty does restrict classes, and oftentimes if they cannot perform, they're not brought. And if they are brought, their numbers are a little bit more realistic in that sense. And Mythic Plus, which is when they're being brought, these scores here are based on completion. So if a class has been used for completion, the speed and difficulty of the key that was used, right? So if Outlaw does a +22 and then Destruction does a +11, based on the time and scale, that's where the scoring comes from. Now, these are all sorted in their own respective categories, so you can see which classes are performing the best in that category. And then on the right side of the screen, right under my big fat head, you'll see them stacked on their total score across all 3 categories. So let's jump into it. We know we have balance changes coming on Tuesday. I did a video covering that as well. I'll put a link for that down in the description if you want to know what's being buffed and nerfed. And a lot of it is kind of telling based on what we're seeing here. The first spec on top of everything in all 3 categories, we actually, for the first time, I think, we have a single spec in all 3 at the top and a single spec in all 3 at the bottom. So Outlaw Rogue is outperforming every class in every category: Heroic Raid, Mythic Raid, and Mythic Plus. They are just bananas, insane, crazy. And at the very bottom, we have Destruction Warlock, which is underperforming every class in the game in all 3 categories. So hey, I mean, I guess if we were playing golf at where the lowest score wins, Destruction Warlock would be the best. So there it is. At the very top, Outlaw Rogue. Right underneath that for total is Subtlety Rogue. And they do quite well in Mythic Raid. They get outparsed by Assassination, Arcane, and Unholy in Heroic. But when difficulty starts to matter more, Subtlety rises above those specs. And then they only lose out to Outlaw Rogue and Arcane Mage in Mythic Plus. Arcane Mage continuing to be amazing in Mythic Plus. So if you're running Mage or you're thinking about picking up a Mage, Arcane Mage is absolutely nuts. Arcane Mage is 3rd overall. They are 2nd in Mythic Plus. Heroic Raid, they're 3rd overall, and they're much lower, closer to the middle in Mythic Raid, being beat out by several other classes. But in Mythic Plus, they are so good, and Heroic Raid, their parses are nuts, which tells you that when they're left to their own devices and they're able to just kind of slam out damage without having to deal with the difficulty of Mythic Raid, they can parse exceptionally well. 4th is Unholy DK. They've been slowly creeping up with the adjustments that we saw to Enhancement Shaman, Windwalker, and Marksmanship Hunter. We actually saw Unholy DK climb up, and it's also partly due to people getting better and better gear. Unholy DK is doing insanely well in Heroic Raid. They're 4th. In Mythic Raid, they're 3rd. They're just about in the top 3rd for Mythic Plus, but they still, they do insane, incredible damage. Windwalker is in the 5th spot, mostly because of their Mythic Plus score. They're 4th overall for Mythic Plus. In Heroic Raid, where everyone's just kind of gets to go crazy, Windwalker falls behind in the 7th or 8th location here. But Mythic Raid, they climb up a little bit higher to 6th. So they're able to get more damage out, mostly because they have high mobility. So when classes get punished due to difficulty more, Windwalker does better overall. But they do amazingly in Mythic Plus. They also have some really nice utility that allow them to be brought in a lot of scenarios. They can do their leg sweep, which is an instant AoE stun. A lot of the dungeons this season need constant AoE stuns, especially with big pulls. So Windwalker is in that spot. Enhancement Shaman is holding 6th. Even after the nerfs they received, they're doing excellent in Mythic Raid. They're number 4 in Mythic Raid. Heroic Raid, they're lower. They're getting outparsed by some of the other classes. but when in difficulty, in high difficulty rating, they do really well. And they do, again, maybe top third, just above Unholy in Mythic Plus. Underneath that is Marksmanship Hunter, which they did get nerfed. And remember, in 10.0.5, Marksmanship is losing double tap and getting some changes there as well. So more stuff on the way for Marksmanship. We'll see how that actually affects them. They're doing great in Heroic Raid. As difficulty goes up, they drop slightly, and then they're even lower in Mythic Plus, but still in the top third. So Marksmanship Hunter, amazing, still top third, very good. Havoc Demon Hunter has been kind of bouncing around. They were actually, in the first 2 weeks where everyone wasn't super geared yet, they were in the top 5. And they've been slowly being knocked out of that position by classes like Unholy DK, by Subtlety Rogue, or Windwalker. They've been kind of getting bumped down by those, but they're still in the top third, and they're much better in Mythic Plus than they are in Raid, just because they are so good at AoE burst. They can clear a whole bunch of mobs all at once, and they can also do great single target damage. Balanced Druid is doing much better in Mythic Plus than they are in Mythic Raid, and there are some changes on the way for them as well. They're about middle of the pack for Mythic Raid. They, they're probably just slightly below the midway line. They do maybe top third for Heroic Raid, and then in Mythic Plus, they're 6th overall, which is super strong. So another great class to bring for Mythic Plus. They also bring Battle Res, they have Stealth, they have Stampeding Roar, they have a lot of different tools that are super nice. They have Typhoon to deal with mechanics and affixes. So overall, better in Mythic Plus and doing okay in Raid. Below balance is Assassination Rogue, and the main reason for this is really just Mythic Plus. In Heroic Raid, when they're left to their own devices and they can just do damage, their damage is insane. It's incredibly good, especially in single target. They have some awesome Garrotes, and they're even doing well in PvP. But as the difficulty goes higher, you have to swap targets more often, and you're being pressured more by the mechanics of the encounter. Assassination falls down in Mythic Raid, and then they're just not being brought much in Mythic Plus. So they're in the bottom third for Mythic Plus. They would have been much higher based on their scores in Raid, but Mythic Plus, they're just not being brought in favor of Outlaw or Subtlety, which are being brought all the time. I've even seen some high 20, mid 20, 22 to 24 keys where they're bringing 2 rogues instead of 1, just because they're so absolutely pog crazy. So underneath Assassination is Demonology. Demonology, mostly because of their Mythic Plus score. You can see that in Heroic Raid, even when they're left to their own devices, they're doing about average. And in Mythic Raid, they're in the bottom quarter, and they're not really showing any signs of coming out of that. They are, however, doing excellent in Mythic Plus. Most of that is just from their insane cleave. When they have the Fellstorm coming out and they can stack all their imps together, they can do some really good damage. And then if you have other classes that can really stack up on single target, you can make some really awesome pulls happen with the Demonology Warlock. And they have Lock Rocks and all kinds of utility. Underneath Demonology is Fury, just above the halfway line. They were much higher. And this is actually quite sad to see because, like I said, in week 1 and 2, they were kind of like Havoc Demon Hunter. They were up there in maybe the top 7, top 6. And usually in expansions and new seasons, Fury scales really well with gear, and they tend to go higher and higher with gear. But as people are getting better and better gear, Fury has been falling down. And even now, shockingly, Arms got some buffs in the last class tuning. Arms is now outperforming Fury in Raid. Not in Mythic Plus. Fury is about average, and Arms is below that in Mythic Plus. But Arms is now outperforming Fury in Heroic Raid and Mythic Raid. So do with that what you will. Frost DK has been picked up a ton in Mythic Raid, but everywhere else is struggling. Heroic Raid, left alone, they don't parse all that well. Mythic Raid, they parse extremely well. And there's probably several reasons for this, but a lot of it just comes down to being able to swap between targets and get enough uptime. They also have a lot of decent defensives that allow them to go through mechanics and eat through mechanics across all of Vault of the Incarnates. And then in Mythic Plus, they're bottom of the barrel. They're in the bottom 6, not doing super great in performance, so they're really struggling there. But they are doing quite well in Mythic Raid. So if you're a Frost DK main, go in and start doing some raiding. Arms Warrior is underneath Frost DK. They are overall less than Fury, which sounds kind of weird, but the main reason for that is the scoring for Heroic Raid overall is lower because it just doesn't have as much weighting. So when you add all of the scores together, Fury still does slightly more than Arms, but Arms is outperforming Fury in rating specifically. And you can see by the bars on the right just how narrow that window is. It's almost like its own little clump of data there is, Fury, Frost DK, Arms, and Feral. They're all pretty close, but Frost DK does better in Raid, and then Fury does better in Mythic Plus, which puts them a little bit higher than the others. Underneath Arms is Feral. Feral doing very poorly in Heroic Raid, about average in Mythic Raid, and then above average in Mythic Plus. They're seeing some buffs coming. On Tuesday, they're going to get a 3% damage increase overall across the board, which should help them score much better going into the encounters next week. But they probably still need a little bit more love after that, as we're getting to a point where people should be reaching 2 and 4 set bonuses where their gear is supposed to be. They're hitting their crucial breakpoints and stats. So if they're still underperforming, then that would be something to look at. Elemental Shaman underneath Feral in the overall. Again, another class that did much better at the start, but has been slowly starting to be outperformed by other specs as the gear gets better. They're just about average in Heroic Raid and Mythic Plus, and they're below average in Mythic Raid. They're just not being brought in Mythic comps or Mythic Raid as much as some of the others. Ret Paladin, which is also seeing a pretty big buff going into Tuesday. They're getting a couple of their core abilities scaled up in damage quite significantly, so we'll see if that helps out a lot. Heroic Raid, Ret is pretty low. Mythic Plus, Ret is pretty low. And then they're just above average in Mythic Raid that are being brought. There's some soak mechanics in Vault of the Incarnate, so having a class that can bubble and become immune is super nice. It's nice on Council with melee interrupts, and they have freedom for Senarth. They can soak all kinds of things, which is pretty useful. And in these circumstances where everything's perfect, they can parse quite well. Underneath Retribution is Shadow Priest. They've been like inching up one spot every week. They've just been fighting tooth and nail for every slot, and they are getting some pretty significant buffs on Tuesday as well. So you'll see them hopefully rise a little bit up from where they are right now. But overall, you can see Heroic Raid, they parse a little bit better than in Mythic Raid, and in Mythic Raid, they're just not really being brought much. They are doing excellent, about just above average in Mythic Plus compared to some of these insane classes, and they're not even too far away from the top upper third cohort there. So overall doing okay, but we'll see what the buffs take them. Devastation Evoker. I have yet to see a Devastation Evoker truly impress me. I've had maybe 1 or 2 that did some insane parsing, but other than that, they've been kind of average or meh. They're getting some pretty significant buffs as well on Tuesday. You can see they're just below the halfway line on Heroic Raid, Mythic Raid, but Mythic Plus, about the same. They're just kind of meh. They bring Bloodlust. They have, they're getting buffs. We'll see if that takes them up. BM, Beast Mastery, the king and queen of pre-patch and week 1, has fallen hard. They are down towards the bottom now. They do averagely in Heroic Raid when you can just go crazy. And in Mythic Raid, they're in the bottom 5. So super struggling, and in the bottom 4 for Mythic Plus. So they can't really hold a candle to marksmanship. That's kind of always been the case in Mythic Plus, but take that for what you will. Fire Mage is at the bottom 3 for rating in both categories, and then they're in the bottom 7 for Mythic Plus. They are also seeing, along with Frost Mage, some pretty significant buffs going into Tuesday. The Fire Mages specifically, all their core abilities are getting their damage scaled up, so hopefully that's enough to give them a nice little bump. Underneath Fire is Survival Hunter. Shockingly, Survival is not the worst in Mythic Plus. They are better than Destruction Warlocks, rejoice. All Survival Hunters, and then I guess Sorrow for all Destruction Warlocks. But they are down there at the bottom in Mythic Plus. They do okay-ish in Mythic Raid, still in the bottom 6, and then bottom 4, bottom of the barrel for Heroic Raid. And then underneath Survival, you have Frost Mage. Frost Mage, basically towards the bottom. They do really poorly in Heroic Raid, but in Mythic Raid, the player skill is higher and the there's more on the line, so people are playing better. Frost Mage can do somewhat better, but they're still not even close to standing up to Arcane Mage. Frost Mage is also getting some buffs on Tuesday. And then lastly, we have the last two Warlocks. They are, if you add them all together, at the very bottom. Affliction is in the bottom 2 for Mythic Raid. They do a little bit better in Heroic Raid, and then they're in the bottom 3 for Mythic Plus. And then a standard deviation away from the rest is Destruction Warlock. You can see it in the bars on the right side. Oh my god, you can definitely see Outlaw is like a standard deviation away from the pack in first place, and Destruction is a standard deviation behind the pack in the bottom. So Destruction needs love, man. They're suffering so hard. Survival used to be down there, but they got a little love and people are doing better. Destruction is suffering, but they are also getting some buffs. So Affliction Warlock, Destruction Warlock are both getting buffed on Tuesday. But that is the DPS rankings for week number 4. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Is this what you expected? What do you think this is going to change going into Tuesday with all the buffs and nerfs we're getting? Are there some classes that are getting ignored too much going into 10.0.5? Or do you think that some are in exactly where they should be? Let me know your thoughts. I'd love to chat with you about it. As always, if you have any questions or comments for me, you'll find me live every day on twitch.tv/Drybear. Come by and say hi. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content, link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.